All right, so let's conclude this lecture on analogical reasoning. So we're going to continue this discussion that we started in the first part, and in particular, we're going to begin by calling into question some of the conclusions from the first part. These conclusions are that apes, but not monkeys, can do relational mapping, and also that language training is necessary. So we're going to start with that. And then we're going to end by discussing the possibility and evidence for the claim that species other than primates can successfully do relational match to sample. So mapping on the basis of common relationships between domains. And what we're going to see is that certain species like crows and parrots can do remarkably well on these tasks that often primates struggle with. All right, so let's begin by looking at something that we addressed last time, which is that monkeys presumably cannot learn to do mapping on the basis of common relationships. Right, that was the skeptical conclusion that was arrived at. But I want to tell you about a more recent study by Fleming and colleagues, which showed that baboons, which are a species of monkey, right? They're not apes, they're monkeys. They can do relational mapping. Moreover, they don't require language training. Right? Last time we saw that to get some primates to be able to do this task, you have to teach them a symbol for sameness and a symbol for difference. And here we see that that's not necessary. So in their study, they compared 8 baboons' performance to the performance of 8 humans on very similar tasks. So they tested 2 claims. First, that baboons can determine whether the relationship between 2 sets of objects is the same or different. Right? That's relational mapping. And the other claim is that baboons can discriminate between degrees of similarity. Okay, so we'll test both of these claims. So the training task was different from the relational match to sample task was different from the one that we've seen before. In particular, earlier versions of this task have used only 2 items as the sample, and each set of choices in the choice point was also composed of 2 items. Here, there's 4 objects in the sample, and each set of choices has 4 objects as well. So we can see here on the left, the sample would be like 4 squares, and then the choices would be, for example, 4 diamond shapes or 4 different figures. So choosing the 4 sample or the 4 diamonds would be the correct choice for the left one. And on the right, we have as a sample 4 different geometric figures. And then the choices are either 4 squares or 4 different geometric figures, and you have to choose the ones that are all different. So this was how they were trained, right? So rather than using 2 objects in each set, they used 4. Maybe making it more salient, more obvious that these objects are either the same or different, instead of just having 2. So as I said, humans did a very similar version of the task. And the participants in the study were rewarded during the training for correctly matching the relations. So if all 4 objects were the same in the sample, and they chose the one where all the objects are the same, they received the reward. And if all the objects were different in the sample, they received the reward for choosing the choice that had all 4 different items. And they continued doing this until they attained 80% accuracy in 2 blocks of training trials. But again, we want to see that they're able to transfer what they've learned to a new set of items, so that's why they also had transfer trials, right? To show that they simply haven't learned how to respond to these specific items. So the transfer trials are a little tricky to explain. So the sample items, so there's always a sample and a choice, right? The sample items varied in how many objects were the same, right? They varied from all being the same to all being different. So you can see that in the figure here. right? AAAA would be where all 4 objects are the same. AAAB would be 3 are the same, 1 is different. In the next sample, 2 objects are the same. So there's 2 sets of same objects, right? AA and BB. In the fourth one, 2 objects are the same, and the rest are different. And in the last one, all 4 objects are different, right? So there's a degree of difference or a degree of similarity here. All right. So in the first one, they're all the same, and in the rest, and in the second, third, fourth, and fifth sample, they're all different, but they differ. They vary in how many items are the same within each of those. Now, importantly, in the transfer trials, the choice stimuli were always either all the same or all different. Right, so here there was no variability. Right, they're all the same or they're all different. And we'll see why that's important in a minute. So what they looked at, what they recorded, was the likelihood of matching the various kinds of sample stimuli to choices that are either the same or different. Right? And they did this for both baboons and humans. So what's the likelihood of matching a sample to either the choice stimulus that's all the same or all different? So let's start with the most obvious ones, right? When the sample objects were all the same, baboons tended to match it overwhelmingly with all the same choice. And when all 4 objects were different, they also tended to match it with the all different choice. Okay, so this performance is exactly the same as in the training, but with new stimuli. But already we can see that this undermines previous conclusions. Why? Because no language training was necessary, right? They weren't taught any symbols for sameness or difference. And 2, they succeeded even though they're monkeys and not apes. But as I said, they were also interested in whether they can discriminate degrees of similarity here. So as I said, the samples some were all the same, some were all different, but there was also a degree of similarity between the ones that were different. So the samples that were different but had some of the same objects, so AAAB, AABB, and AABC, were also more likely to be classified as different than the same, right? Which makes sense because they're not all the same. But the more different objects that were present in the sample, the more likely that they would be classified as different. Right? So there is a sensitivity to a degree of similarity here. So they know they're all different, but the more items that are in common in the sample, the more likely, the more items that are different in the sample, the more likely they are to classify it as different. And what's interesting is that the pattern of results is identical for humans and baboons. So another way of presenting these results is with this figure. We have on the y-axis the proportion of different responses, so how likely they are to say that the sample matches the different choice. Again, 50% would be chance. And on the x-axis we have a different type of sample stimulus. Right? So when the sample stimulus contains items that are all the same, we see they're in the transfer trials they're very unlikely to assign it to match it with a different category, right? And if we go all the way to the far right, when the sample stimulus contains items that are all different, they're very likely to assign it to match it to the choice stimulus that is all different. And there's lines here for both the chimpanzees, for the baboons, Papio, and Homo sapiens, which are the humans. But we can also see that when the different stimuli vary, right? When they have more or less common items, that there's a sensitivity here to that difference. right? So the more different items that are present in the sample, the more likely that they are to be matched to the different choice set. So there are two things to look at here. Number one is that all of the different items are much more likely to be categorized as different than same, right? So for all the choice stimuli that are different, they're more likely to be categorized for all the sample stimuli that are different, they're more likely to be categorized as different than the same. But the more different they are, the more likely that they are to be matched to the different choice stimulus. All right, so the way that Fleming and colleagues summarize this is by saying that baboons, like humans, can categorically identify whether a relationship in one set of objects is the same or different, right? So they're mapping on the basis of common relationships. But also interestingly, baboons, like humans, can detect degrees of similarity in the relations between objects, right? So they're not just treating them as all the same or all different. They are sensitive, they are aware that there are degrees of similarity that are present. And the interesting thing again is that they can do this without being trained symbols for sameness and difference. So monkeys can definitely succeed, at least certain types of monkeys, right? Specifically baboons. But the other thing I want to point out is that you may need to train them with items, with more items than just a simple two that are normally seen in relational mapping tasks. All right, so let's turn now to another issue, which is whether only primates can solve these kinds of tasks. And so most of the studies on analogy have looked at primates. But as we saw earlier, it's possible that avian species might perform better in some of these tasks, right? We've seen that they do better in some cognitive tasks like the trap-tube problem, right? We saw that crows did better than many types of apes. So maybe they can do analogy too, right? And there's a hint at this in the discussion of Taylor's experiment, right? Where the crows, the New Caledonia crows, were able to generalize what they learned from the trap-tube problem to the superficially different trap-table problem, right? So this suggests that they may have certain analogical reasoning abilities. So to this end, Smirnova and colleagues looked at relational mapping in crows. And they trained two crows using an identity match to sample task. Right, so this is not relational mapping. Right, so the crows were shown a stimulus and they're taught to match it to another stimulus. So one object mapped onto another object. So a red disk should be mapped to a red disk and not to a blue disk. So they were trained to do this matching on the basis of color, shape, and number. And once they mastered this, they presented them with the relational match to sample task. No training on relational mapping whatsoever. But they were the crows spontaneously were able to generalize what they learned in the individual mapping to the relational mapping. So they spontaneously started to match common relationships. Right. And if you copy and paste this link onto your web browser, you can see a YouTube video of this crow doing this task. Right, very fascinating, matching on the basis of common relations between the sample and the choice books. And just finally, a study by Obozova and colleagues, also from 2015, they did a similar study with parrots, right, specifically orange-winged Amazonian parrots, and they also found that they were able to do this spontaneously. So why is that? Well, crows, like parrots, are highly telencephalized, and the telencephalon is the avian analog of the primate and the mammalian neocortex. Right, the neocortex and neocortical size is correlated with intellectual abilities in mammals, and likewise intellectual abilities in birds are linked to the telencephalon. So why should they have these extra cognitive abilities? Well, both crows and parrots live in very complex groups, right? They have complex social groups that encompass multiple generations, right? They live in variable environments, so they don't specialize, right? They're generalists. They have a wide range of environments that they have to solve problems in. And also they have long developmental periods, relatively speaking. And all of these characteristics have been linked with higher level intellectual abilities. So it shouldn't surprise us that they're able to do these tasks. So again, bird brain doesn't necessarily mean that a creature is not going to have high level intellectual abilities. Alright, so in this lecture we discussed relational matching by baboons who have not been language trained, and we saw that they're able to do the task with the right type of training, right? And they can perform very similar to humans. And we also saw that crows and parrots can also spontaneously match relations, even if they haven't been trained to do that. So higher level intellectual skills are not just limited to primates, and in some cases, right, avians may be able to do better than the primates.